Okay, good afternoon. So, what we're going to do in this lecture is think about this image. It is an image of Manchester in the 19th century, early 19th century. And it is produced by one of the premier architects of the 19th century, of 19th century Germany, Carl Friedrich Schinkel. So, with this image, I want you to think about in whose image is a city built. So Schinkel visited Manchester. It was one of those hot, cities to visit in the 19th century because it was a booming city. So what do you see in this image?
High towering structures.
Sorry?
High towering structures, buildings.
Okay, a set of buildings, right?
Boxed.
Okay,
Structures.
rectangular structures, yeah. Boxy, maybe, yeah.
A boat.
Yeah, there's a boat. In other words, there's a waterway in there, right? There's a river. What else do you see?
Chimney.
There are chimneys. In other words, there are smokestacks, right? Because they're factories burning coal. Yeah. What else?
We can see some roads, and then the tower might be the clock tower, the small.
And the back? Yeah.
Towards the
Sure. What else do you see?
I'm not sure if that was correct, but I will see a couple of houses towards this side.
Yeah, they're on the left-hand side. There are shorter, lower height buildings. But what is the effect? It's a very accomplished draftsman. Okay, these people knew really how to draw. Okay, so what you see, it's a pen and ink sketch. What is he trying to convey?
Paint an industrial city.
See, this is the trouble. There are no established industrial cities in the 19th century. So he's, representing a new phenomenon. What is he representing? How is he representing it?
Capitalism.
Buildings suggesting modernism.
So what is modern about these buildings?
Cubicles, rooms and the structure of the whole building.
So this is what I've gotten from you, that there are multiple levels of floors, really. Okay, so there are they are large rectangular structures. But what makes you think they're modern?
Plain and utility based all the structures and design.
So they are based on, there's clearly something utilitarian about them because there's no decorative features, right?
Just like no baroque or such kind of embellishment over.
There's no embellishment, that's great. So there's no embellishment, they are quite stark in there. But what still characterizes them, and he gives them a definition, apart from their rectangular boxiness. So here you have the rectangular boxiness, you have the chimneys, there is the river, Irwell, and there is, the boats. These are repetitive, rectangular. It just goes like this. So they're repetitive. They're not just rectangular, they're repetitive, modular structures. Used we are to see modern and industrial buildings, you have no idea how wonderfully novel this was in the early 19th century. This was worth depicting. This was that novel. Because buildings of any kind of importance had, as you mentioned, embellishment. You had to make them look respectable. These are utilitarian structures that are of paramount importance to the global economy. So that's what he's trying to represent. And he's very much used to representing, what was the sort of the reigning vocabulary of the time, which is late 18th and early 19th century. It would be some version of neoclassicism. So let's think about this a little more. So this interests Carl Friedrich Schinkel, but it also interests a lot of other people, like the other Karl, Marx, Engels, and a whole bunch of social reformers, commentators, and politicians. because this is where things are happening. So since you already offered the idea of capitalism, we think we know what capitalism is. Again, you have to think in the early 19th century, what is capitalism, right? Because it's taking form. It's not formed yet, it's taking form. So it's cities like this, like Manchester, it is taking a certain industrial form. There is agro-capitalism before, there's no doubt about it. And there has been, since I introduced the idea of promissory notes, Abhishek and I were chatting in the right in here, is that how those promissory notes were really large. Money was really, currency was really large, and they became small. But even in the late 18th century, when Bank of England, first offered the pound notes, they were seen to be not, acceptable, because they're not the real thing. They're not gold or they're not silver, because they don't have inherent value. Value is ascribed to them, right? And you have to trust that value. So a new economy, a new set of buildings, a new landscape is emerging. And so we have to kind of parse, how does it do so? So I've given you to read David Harvey's chapter on money, space, and time. And I'm going to refer to, I'm going to look at the two cities, Manchester and Chicago. And in Chicago, I'm going to refer to William Cronon's understanding of Chicago as how does a city like that, born out of, both of these cities are born out of almost nothing, small settlements, become these booming metropolises within a few decades. And it took very little time. And the impact of that. So I suppose most of you know the rudiments of capitalism, right? So it's a mode of production defined by centralized ownership of production and a system of wage labor. We all know what wage labor is. I don't have to go into that, right? Yes or no? Yes, you know. Good. Now, so it is defined by what we call class interests, right? There are capitalists who own the means of production and the laborers who don't, right? So this is my, elaboration of something that David Harvey actually provides. Because I'm interested in how the process of capitalism and the circulation of capital actually impacts, spaces. So here M starts for money, the capital, let's say. And C1 is commodity, transformed by labor, produces C2, another set of commodities, which are sold in the market, and M plus delta M is the profit, okay? So this is a very rudimentary, as very, almost caricatural understanding of what capitalism is as a process in terms of involvement of capital. And of course, here is the role of primitive accumulation. And primitive accumulation is, where do you get that initial M from, right? Where does one get the initial M from? You want to start a factory in the early 19th century, where do you get money from? Where do you get the capital from?
Either through inheritance or through bank loans, financial institutions.
That is, there are only 3 rules of getting money: beg, borrow, or steal, right? So you can ask your mom to give you the money, right? Or you can ask a lending institution, and there are lending institutions, but they're also emerging. Okay, they're not established, lending institutions, so they're forming themselves sort of in league with these new developments. Okay, the other thing is that where does the inheritance come from? Where does my mom get the money? Well, at some point, it's primitive accumulation. It's accumulation by violence. Okay. And in England, it took a particular form because of the series of enclosures and its colonial ventures. So let's think about this again. So here is capital being converted into profit. The question is, where does the profit go? This is the fundamental contradiction of capital, is that for capital to circulate, it must fix itself. It must fix itself in buildings, infrastructure. Okay? Then it can destroy it, but once it's stuck, who is working on railways here? Okay, you should know that once railway lines are put in, that's stuck capital. To pull that off is really hard, because then you're not going to recoup the investment anytime. In other words, it's a long-term investment, right? So these are things that these capitalists are always thinking about. Why would you put down those lengths of rail lines if it's not something you can destroy immediately or whenever you need it? So the question is, if capital must circulate, let's say you're taking the delta M and you're making this earlier M bigger, right? But it's only so big you can make that, because what will happen if you make it too big? You'll end into the problem of overproduction and overaccumulation. You need markets. Otherwise, you don't have anywhere to send those goods, right? That's why in the 19th century, historically, industrial capitalism kept apace with colonial expansion. Because one of the important functions of colonial expansion was opening up markets. Forget trade. Opening up markets is what it needed. Now, let's think about these in terms of spaces. Now, if you're a good capitalist, you are taking the delta M and you're still trying to make that bigger, but you need to be savvy about how you're dealing with. Because you're also dealing with different agencies and different parts of the world, different processes. So, since we are going to talk about Manchester, let's imagine we are, somebody is building a cotton industry. You need the raw materials, you need warehouses, factories for pretty much, anything. And these are not colonial, settlement factories, which were pretty much only warehouses. These are factories, like the ones that Trinkel is representing. So you need resource from a mining country because you need fuel. And that's something that England actually had, was coal reserves. So here, if you're going to think about cotton, there's an entire infrastructure connected to colonies and plantations. There is no industrial revolution without the extensive colonial plantations in the US and other parts of the world. In other words, it might seem like the problem of Manchester, but it's really a global problem. And that's not a new thing, we know that. But there's also, what do you do with commodities? What do the commodities need to be, sold? But you need, again, sets of warehouses, markets, you need an entire infrastructure for those to be distributed. But here, the problem of profit is that because you enter the problem of overaccumulation, you try to put them in secondary and tertiary sectors. This is why we have endowed educational institutions, because you're siphoning off the money and hoping some return, very long-term return, mind you, in terms of knowledge production, in terms of cultural production, and so on and so forth. And yes, tax benefits. So there are entire systems and entire spaces which we do, in a way, they have nothing to do with factories. Okay, they're kind of seem very removed from the factory proper, or the lives of the working classes proper, that are deeply affected by the system. So keep that in mind when we look at processes. And if you have any question, feel free to speak up. Now, this is all very well to say that this is connected to mining countries, this is connected to colonial plantations. We're talking about India, we're talking about North America, we're talking the Caribbean, we're talking about Egypt, this is cotton. Okay, we're talking all parts of the world. We're talking about these could be in Manchester, it could be in other parts of England. Infrastructure construction, that money that you could go into something in England, but it also could come to, India, okay, because you could invest that money in India and get great benefits because the colonial government was keen to have investment in India. So the question is, what is the effect of this process on the perception of time and space? It is axiomatic that capitalism, and industrial capitalism is what we are thinking of here, sped up time, because you are, the prime goal of capitalist production is more production in less time. So the notion of time and work time changes fundamentally. But think of this, if these are all connected and there's some sense of that connection, the fact that new real estate, new museum, these are new building types. What is a museum in the 19th century? It's a newfangled thing. It's a new building type. People have to figure out how to design these things. They have no idea how to design these things. So it's a kind of in some ways, it's boom time for architects, but it's also a problem that needed solving. In other words, we don't have those 19th century cities the way we think about them without very careful thinking about what form these buildings will take, which will ultimately determine what form the cities take. In other words, you don't randomly throw them around, you actually assemble them very carefully. So the other question is, what kinds of social and spatial distinctions are produced by the system? I'm going to talk a little about workers' housing when we talk about Manchester, but I do want you to think about very, very carefully, very intentionally about what kind of socio-spatial distinctions arise because of the system. And the system is, mind you, structurally the system is constant. Historically it is different, okay? But capitalism must have some structural constants to be called capitalism, okay? Otherwise it's not capitalism. But historically it takes very different forms in different locations. So keep those in mind as I look through as I show you the images. Now, of course, the leitmotif of capitalism is economy, efficiency in economic production. So what happens is that the way it's achieved is that you're centralizing, the machines, you're centralizing labor. So before that, cotton production or any kind of linen production, that was what something England produced. It was not a great place of cotton production. So linen, because flax is native to the country, so there's linen production. There was some spots of wool production, which is a Flemish artisans who had settled in England. So there are spots of textile production, but they were all the way we can think of as produced in hamlets, not unlike what happened in this part of the world. The process was somewhat different, but it is really scattered and small, small artisanal production. So you're taking those activities and those capacities and you're putting them in one location. But you also, because you need a lot of labor, you are also streamlining the system. So machines here take a very large role of not just streamlining the system, it's also making it fast. And there is a whole bunch of technological achievements that made possible the faster production of cotton, which before the 19th century is very much a hand loom mode of producing yarn from cotton and clothing from yarn. So one of the interesting things about different historical situations is that in England, in Manchester, while they were primarily male, what started happening in New England, in the US, is that they were primarily women. These were women from farming families who became the primary workers in cotton mills. And they were actually educated, they were not educated. And they are, as the saying goes, they were working so their brothers could go to Harvard. But whether that is always the case or not, the point is that they wanted to become earning members and took on this work. So there's a huge skewed population of women in New England as opposed to in Manchester. In Manchester, we're going to talk about it, it's mostly immigrant labor. And where is the immigrant labor coming from? People just don't migrate to cities because I love a job in a cotton factory. So there is something about the large space and gathering a large number of people in one space produces also a contradiction. You want a docile labor force, ideally, and women were actually considered docile. They turned out to be not, okay? But that's a perception of what you expected them to be. But it was important that they learn, and everybody learn, the discipline of synchronized work, which means you have to arrive at the factory at the particular time, very early, and working days were 14, 16 hours, mind you, okay? And leave at the same time, because one of the problems with machine is that if you don't do your work, you're doing a repetitive work. If you don't do your work, nothing else will proceed, right? And that's, of course, the only thing the workers can control, which is how the work is actually conducted. So, what we describe as the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century has, think about it, is two components. One is the historical process, the historical conditions, and the other is structural conditions. The historical conditions in England were particular. In every country it is particular because historically it is very distinctive. In England, a common question is asked, why did it take off in England before anywhere else? Because a lot of factors came together in a very convenient manner. One is, of course, the resource and wealth from the colonies. Without that, it would not have been possible. But at the same time, there was this second factor, enclosures. And enclosures, do you guys know what enclosures are, by the way? Okay. Enclosures are literally enclosing common lands, pastures, and making them private property. So what it would look like in a map is that this is a map of Barton before enclosure. So this is the village, okay? And these are, inks means they're meadows, by the way, okay? Field, south field, and you can have common fold. There's cow pasture, horse pasture. So the designated areas which these are more or less equally available to the people in the village to have their sheep or goat or horses use the space. And what happens after enclosure is this land, this common land, gets broken up into smaller pieces. They become literally private property. This is the emergence of this very modern notion of private property. Private property, in other words, the idea that you can enclose land and you can alienate it freely, is a modern notion. So this is being enacted, at a furious pace in the late 18th century in England. It has started with Queen Elizabeth's reign, but the pace became really fast in the late 18th century and carried into the 19th century, causing tremendous overhaul of not just land possession rights, but also entire populations. Because what do the people do who have lost their little bit of land and little bit of possibility of survival? They have to either work in larger estates or they must migrate to other places of job opportunities. So this is where instead of just agro labor, you have factory labor taking shape. Now, long before India or other parts of the world were colonized with any degree of violence, Ireland was colonized with an extreme brutality. And Irish immigrant labor formed a very major part of cities like Manchester, because they literally had nowhere else to go. So think of these as processes of movement of people, circulation of capital, coming in very, let's call it innovative ways. And I'm not giving innovation here any necessarily positive value, it's just saying it's new, okay? These processes are new. You don't have to be thinking that they're, wonderful things that are happening, but they are new, to be sure. So what happens is that these two historical factors are extremely important for the development of a city like Manchester. And these things, these are full of iron production, steam engines, mechanization of the textile industry, local entrepreneurs in Manchester had a big role to play. Many of them were dissenters, religious dissenters, who had found in entrepreneurial work kind of a social role, if you will. And it's a complex story. And of course, there's a new way of organizing labor, which is in large numbers of laborers in one place and according to certain time routines. So these last part, that's what I call the structural conditions. These are historical conditions. So depending on the place and location, these would be different. We're looking at England for the moment. Now, one thing that England did have is coal reserves. And the mining country is fairly close. I mean, this is northern England, this is industrial, what is now industrial England, or now deindustrialized England. So whether it is the mining of coal, whether these factories, they were all, mind you, in the early 19th century, subjects of visual representation. They were painted, they were depicted in, for the most part, with great adoration, that this is a great achievement because this is the engine of progress. That term was very much used. What this process causes, between the historical and the structural, mostly the structural, is that it entails an abstraction of money, space, and time. All that concrete place called Manchester becomes something else, begins to share something similar with, let's say, some other part of the world, another emerging industrial city, because it shares something deeply structural. Historical conditions are necessarily, again, different. The abstraction of money, time, and space, and this is one of David Harvey's very important contributions. The way he explains this, that all abstraction, in other words, their removal, their distancing from concrete social relations. Money is no longer gold or silver you can weigh, that becomes that ephemeral piece of paper. That's a form of abstraction. But time also becomes abstract. It is no longer seasonal time. It is no longer festival time. Even the fairs that I showed you earlier in the morning, the fairs at Chua, they are seasonal fairs, and seasonal fairs were always tied to holy days. They were necessarily tied to holy days. So fairs and holy days were very deeply, that notion was very deeply entrenched. So I want you to think about this as taking sort of, in a way, they're not necessarily linear relations, but fragmentation, rationalization, homogenization, and commodification must happen for this to actually produce the spaces of capitalism. Now, here is our merchant from today's morning's talk. And he is, again, surrounded by pieces of paper. And this is something that Simmel, and this is, work is obviously published in the early 20th century. The quote is from 1978, from a book from 1978. Only in a stable and closely organized society that assures mutual protection and provides safeguards against a variety of elemental dangers is it possible for such a delicate and easily destroyable material to become money. In other words, not possible. So I'm going to move away from the camera to do this. This is the dollar note. Okay? Tear it. Maybe he doesn't have qualms. He can tear it.
You are the possessor of that.
Well, I'm a possessor. It's just a dollar note. It doesn't matter. I'm the possessor of a dollar note. See, dollar note is very interesting because it is money is a great equalizer, right? No matter who carries it, whether I carry it or you carry it or he carries it, doesn't matter. It has exactly the same value. Okay? It's a great equalizer. Why aren't you willing to tear it? I do this to my students. Why not tear it? You want me to tear it? No? He definitely doesn't want me to tear it.
Yes.
Any takers? No takers? Well, I'll do it. You know what? In the US, you can tape it back and use it in the market. Indian rupees, you can't. You have to take it to the bank and apologize profusely. And they still might not take it back. The thing is that I can do this because it is eminently destroyable. That's what Simmel is talking about. In something that is eminently destroyable, we have put in so much trust. We have agreed conventionally that this thing has value, when it is just as destroyable as any piece of paper you're writing on, right? Now, this is also a federal offense. Okay? And why is it a federal offense? Because it's legal tender, and legal tender, in other words, the federal government knows that you can tear it very easily, right? So to retain the validity of a legal tender, it needs to impose its force.
The state has to impose its force and law.
Yep. So this is the felony. Okay, I'm going to be a good person and tape it back and introduce it into the market. But you get my point, right? So it's interesting to think. The reason I could do this, because, see, if you ask me to say tear this, or okay, this, I wear a gold bangle. If you say destroy this, I would say I don't think so. Not because I care about the gold, because this belonged to my mother. That has sentimental value. I will not do it. This I have no sentimental value attached to it. Okay, so I will not get rid of this. This I have no problems. So equivalent money. No problems with that. In other words, in some things which we attach monetary value, we still hold dear, Others are perfectly abstract. I could freely alienate it. This I will not alienate. Okay, because this is something else. And what are these, something to think about, what are these something else's that we still hold dear in a very capitalist society that we will not part or alienate? What are those things that in, whether it's cities or not, we will not alienate? And Marx's famous line that all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, refers to the fact that everything has become common. There is something about the democratization of money, but it's also to do with whether you're a teacher, whether you're a preacher, doesn't matter. You're just a wage earner. That's the bottom line. There's something, the precious respect given to teachers, priests, and people who render essential service, important knowledge service to society, makes no difference. What these people were registering, and Marx certainly is registering at that time, is that society in the 19th century, we didn't live through that, was torn asunder from deeply rooted conventions and practices rooted to home life and village life, which were simply not there in their lifetime. In their lifetime, they had to adopt to a factory routine that was alien to them. And it's very difficult for us to realize how alien that was, because we are very used to industrial labor. We started at 4 and I have to finish at 5 because we live by capitalist time, not because of anything else, right? So in other words, if we didn't obey the laws of capitalist time, we would not meet at all, right? We would meet ticket, maybe adha ghanta baad, right? But we would not necessarily meet together. So the point is that abstraction of money does something to social relations, but it also does something to time. In other words, the wage earner must show up at the factory to earn their living. And there were new devices, because these are primarily peasantry, who are used to going to the field when it is light and coming back when it's dark. But they're also used to going home for, food, cooking, etc. And women and men work together. They were not separated, work together. It's basically based around the home and homestead. What happens is that with factory bells and factory clocks, the time is announced, made the same, nothing to do with natural time. That disassociation was terribly troubling and unsettling. Again, it's difficult for us to kind of realize that because we live very different lives, but that required a certain discipline. So this is what David Harvey calls a chronological net in which modern society gets caught. And it has multiple implications, because you can't just develop new machines, new modes of transportation without thinking of the overlaps between these forms of abstraction. The abstraction of space was carried out with a vigor, same vigor with, I would say, time. My favorite one is to show is the Land Ordinance Plan of 1785. This is usually ascribed to Thomas Jefferson's genius. In other words, land west of the Mississippi was going to be platted into, it's called a township map, and township doesn't mean towns. The idea of township in New England is actually villages. So in other words, villages in New England are called towns, okay? So township maps is really a rural map, it's not an urban map. So the idea is that all of the land west of Mississippi would be made into an even grid to be populated by farmers, citizens. And it has had a particular, it's a not just rectangular grid, it's a square grid, actually. So it is even more, how should I say, geometrically, seems like, equivalent. Each space is exactly equivalent to another. Now the township, what it consisted of was that each township here, it's a 36 square miles. Each is a 1 square mile. And it's a rural grid, and so that's one bit. And that square, which is 16, is reserved for schools. So this was a grid, a particular kind of grid with a particular kind of, let's say, social, moral, ethical content implied in it, is being laid out all across. And the reason is because westward moving migrants were constantly coming in conflicts with indigenous people who lived in those lands. So this was a way of settling those lands. So this is a tool of the settler colonial state in the late 18th century. So this grid, I mean, think of this. You actually see, kind of lines of streams here. Earlier, the way you would mark property, idea of private property doesn't begin with this, it precedes. So they would think from the sour apple tree here to that creek there, okay? That would be your understanding. Here, it is precise, it is geometrical. It is very much measurable with the efficiency which is unprecedented. Again, maps, whether they're cadastral maps or other kinds of maps, are not new. But by the 18th century, cartography is taking a modern form, which enabled these kinds of formulations. Think of this. Every bit of land has its peculiar topography. We might not even discern it, but it does. To think of that as perfectly equivalent to another piece because it is the same price, that's because you can alienate this, is a profound abstraction. The idea that you can sell land is profound. You cannot pick it up and put it in somebody's hand. But we do sell land. That, in other words, you presume you own that bit of soil. It's important to recognize that before modern times, this was simply not available to people to think. In other words, you could occupy land, you could give away land, you could own it by, take it by conquest, by long-term occupation, but you could not alienate it freely. And that does something, because it makes land profoundly abstract. In other words, it has an impact on how we think about space, which is profoundly abstract. When time and space come together, and this was very important for railway time, so every town had its own time. Let's say one place was, what time is it now? It's 4:40 here. In the next town it would be 4:43. In the next town it would be, because it's sun is dictating it. And this proved a real problem. So look at what's in here. This is in England. London time is kept at all stations on the railway, which is about 4 minutes earlier than Reading and Steventon and da-da-da-da-da. In other words, those people, whether they're in Reading or Bristol, they have to know what London time is and adjust their time. Their local time is not valid, because otherwise the trains can't run. So London time, because it's a capital, commercial capital, it dictates how the rest of the people in that country would keep time. What happened in the US was even better. The railways decided, we can't, in a bigger country, can't deal with this. They homogenized times between, let's say, because there was so many different times with New York and Philadelphia, not that much long distance. So they came up with railway times, which ultimately became, time zones. In other words, entire stretches of country fall under one time regime, which impacts how you conduct business. It affected how railways moved. In other words, how goods moved, how people moved. We don't think of these, but the time and space are deeply related and became deeply related, particularly with railways, because of it moved fast. It did not move, like with wagons, etc., it was not a problem. It still kind of worked with local time. Something to keep in mind. What it did, and it had a profound impact in England. One of the reasons England still has one of the best railway systems is because it felt the brunt of it early, it dealt with it early. So once these railways, started moving from one location to, the rails started moving from one location to another, particularly those living in the country or in the suburbs, could actually do business in London and go back. That means they didn't have to stay overnight or 3 days or 4 days. That means our time, our language, they could commute. It also gave rise to new types of buildings, well, railway stations. We think of railway stations, oh, railway station, railway station. Somebody had to figure out how to design those. It's not an easy thing. And, you know, stations like King's Cross, Victoria, this is some of the oldest stations actually. And at some point they were also integrated with sewer lines, gas lines in the sense of lighting. In other words, when they were redoing the embankment on the Thames, they integrated all of this. You know, the trains, the gas lines, and the sewage lines, and all integrating all that infrastructure. What these did, that, you know, the impact of this kind of the proliferation of railways is that in 1840, London, this is the Thames, London was on both bank like this. By the time we are talking about, you know, 1929, this is like an ink block, it's spreading. Railways made it possible. Okay, so think of, when we think about cities and suburbs, and expanding suburbs, what enables them? Certain kind of land, you know, property regimes allow it. Sometimes it changes social relations. It changes how we imagine the city. And I mean, London is one of those cities, and many of these cities, which important cities we look at, from London, Chicago, Calcutta, they profoundly changed in the 19th century. They're ultimately what I call the 19th century cities, that you still read the traces of the struggles of the 19th century in the 20th and 21st century you know, existence. Now Manchester is interesting because it already had small-scale textile manufacturing, but it came together with what is described by Peter Hall as an innovative milieu. So that milieu allowed, you know, rapid innovation, one person picking up from another. They were, you know, they freely stole each other's ideas and made it better. Ultimately, I don't want to get into the details of that. Think of this: in 1750, Manchester is a small city, small town. By 1850, you know, it is a massive agglomeration, and you know, there is only stopgap planning happening, right? But development happening is, you know, planning cannot keep pace with the development. Okay? And the city is booming. This is the heydays of Manchester. By the late 19th century, it's already not in the best shape because of the global economy, you know, cotton production and so on and so forth. What made it possible? Very important is immigrant labor, and this was large, you know, very much from the English countryside and from Ireland. And access to local coal and water and cotton from Jamaica, US, India. Important, you cannot keep producing unless you have forcibly opened up markets. Nobody wants to buy cheap Manchester goods until they are controlled markets, basically. So those, and we can talk about the colonial markets, the situation later, its impact on cities. But it is useful to also think about the one thing that, you know, England did have is coal reserves. And so this is Manchester. This is basically, you can see this. This is coal country. Okay, so that's something is, and that's extremely important for fuel is extremely important. So that's something that is locally available, but still requires an infrastructure. And what they did, you know, over a few decades is, so this is South and Manchester are basically twin cities. The river Irwell, I mean, it wasn't, you know, here this is the Irwell. You know, they started drawing canals. Manchester ultimately by the 19th century has also canals inside, so goods, you know, boats can move, warehouses, goods can be brought from the warehouses. But its biggest achievement was it connected it to Mersey Estuary and Liverpool. Liverpool was the ocean-going port. Without that connection, because if this part takes too much time, then there is, again, it's not efficient. So to make production and marketing efficient, both the railway lines were built and the canals. And canals, mind you, require a certain kind of technology to be understood, to be really managed, because what canals do is it can move water across topographical difference, across terrain. In other words, you create lock gates, you bring up the water, you raise up the water, and it goes. It's a brilliant technology, really. But it was done across very large stretches of land to make the movement of goods possible. Something that happens when you build a canal, build a railway, is that the price of land next to it, that goes up. So it gives a fillip to in land values and ultimately real estate. So all of these things become sort of connected. The part that's important for us to sort of register here is that in what all the commentators agreed pretty much on one thing about Manchester, that out of those filthy sewers, it was a very dirty city, into the 20th century, pure gold flows. Because sheer wealth coming out of extremely abject living conditions. And this is the condition of the working class. Engels's famous description, and this is from Engels's book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. If you read the plan, you recognize that most of these have only one opening on one wall. Okay, very compact space, and there are the entire families living there. So these are the sort of the bywords for bad industrial housing, which England was very well known for. And the claim of New England was that our, housing for the women were better. They were basically dorms, okay? But actually they were better than this. So, and what is interesting is that this kind of landscape existed right next to the factories, but in a way that, let's say you are one of the wealthier people, you could see, but you don't have to enter. In other words, they're very much there, but they don't always have to weigh on your consciousness. So people like Engels made sure that it was well known. So it's one thing to draw the factories from the river, the vantage, as Schinkel did, because Schinkel is trying to capture the essence of this modern thing called a factory. And ultimately it would influence his work, because he's used to, well, let's call them curlicues, very deep embellishment. So he would develop a modern vocabulary of even neoclassicism. But the social life of the working class received great deal of attention, analysis, and that's where we get the word slum from. It's an Irish word. So before that, we throw out the word slum all over the place as if everything is a slum. Every working class is not. And it is useful to patiently read through that, and I would encourage you to do that if you haven't read this section of the condition of the working class in England. It's like, he is interestingly worried that there's no rational plan. There is no real. I mean, if it was rational, he could almost give it some kind of approval. That no thought has been given to it. But he recognizes people are making a lot of money from those miserable abodes because they are rented. It is universally applicable that poorer you are, more you spend on housing, more percentage of your income goes into housing than anything else. So let's take another example. I'll keep this short. Chicago, like Manchester, it was a small. It was a kind of a. There was a fort, the U.S. federal fort. There were a multilingual community, the indigenous communities. There were the French were there, so it was a polyglot community, kind of nothing of importance. And the Chicago River had a bend. It was considered too clean to clean itself. It was a slow river, but there was Lake Michigan. Okay, so that's something that was important. So, question is, how did Chicago become this? And this is 1898 image when the plan is being produced. And here is the Chicago River. Here's Lake Michigan. It is a settler colonial city. I'm going to talk a little more about why bother calling something settler colonial and something non-settler colonial. As far as I'm concerned, all colonialism is settler colonialism, but that's a different argument or debate. For the moment, it is very much built in the interests of Eastern, that is the Atlantic seaboard capital. It's not local capital. In other words, its investment is coming from the eastern seaboard, from New York, Philadelphia, to build this city and to reap profit from it. And there's something too interesting about it. And if you think about what is the problem of Chicago, how do you explain Chicago? I mean, like, why Chicago? Because there was so little going for it, in terms of population in 1830. It's 2,000. It's really a small, again, polyglot community. In 1850, it's 30,000. 1900 is 1.7 million. So something clearly is happening. Like, it's become a magnet, right? But there's also, you can read other things similarly. So lot price in 1893, and this is the biggest joke, is $33. It's been platted, basically. Okay, lot price is $33. By 1836, it's 100,000. So this is pure speculation. It's 1836. The city has not built, what we think about 19th century, it's not there yet. But it's the hope that it will. If you purchase it now, it will redeem itself, in many times in the future. So this is pure speculation. And there's a complex process that went into it. Now, Chicago's, and this is William Cronen's, beautiful explanation of how three commodities made Chicago: wheat, meat, and timber. So timber coming from the northern forests. Timber seeds in the, let me see, this does it. Yeah, in 1845, there's no industry. In 1855, it's 500 million board feet. Timber is measured in board feet. And in 1930, it's 1.6 billion board feet. So the timber industry is booming. Where do you go producing so much timber? Well, the entire Midwest is there to be populated, right? So it anticipates and it supplies. So at 1830, it's what the only things that were really sold were fur, blankets, alcohol, and guns. Post 1830, these are the three commodities coming together to create Chicago. But to really understand why these three industries really took off and made Chicago what it is by the mid and certainly the second quarter of the second half of the 19th century, are various factors, and they're sometimes, you can think of them as loosely connected to each other. In other words, some of it is happenstance, some of them are planned. So the Erie Canal was, built in the 1825, enabled Chicago to be connected to the eastern seaboard. And this was a massive infrastructural project. And again, the Michigan-Illinois Canal, I wish I could show you some images, the railways, and then very new building types like the grain elevator and the stockyards. But here I have included, and this is the Battle of Bad Axe. Really nothing to do with Chicago. It was really far from Chicago, but it had an impact. Let me go through this quickly to explain what why this is so important. So the Erie Canal connected New York and the access to markets. This is the Atlantic market, and this is the connection. New York is being established between New York and Albany, and then Albany to Chicago. Okay, so it was built in parts. So what it did was that it connected New York with Lake Michigan, allowing for a kind of a neat water infrastructure to support Chicago. So goods could move to the east. That was its major role. But it, of course, did a lot of other things. It created new markets along the Erie Canal. It greatly increased land speculation both along the way and in Chicago. And Battle of Bad Axe was interesting because it's not near Chicago. It happened to be a massacre of the indigenous groups that this is coming out of the 1804 treaty, and it was a conflict over ceded land that they claimed they were not ceded. And Black Hawk, the Sauk leader, argued that nothing that cannot be carried away cannot be sold. Well, he was clearly wrong, because the U.S. both the US federal government and local speculators make sure it can be sold. In other words, the idea that if you cannot carry it away, you cannot sell it. You cannot alienate it. Well, land was clearly alienable. So what it meant was that because of that skirmish, it was hardly a battle, it was a skirmish, the federal troops who had come to participate in the skirmish sent back stories about opportunities of land speculation. And that created a huge boom, people wanting to move to Chicago and near Chicago to actually settle. And then, interesting thing to think about, if we come across the term hinterland in the next few days, is that hinterlands do not exist. They are created just like any other infrastructure. So as these infrastructural links are being created, new hinterlands are being created. So Michigan-Illinois Canal, and this is because the, again, the Chicago River is a kind of a weak stream, if you will. And it was important to not just connect to the eastern seaboard, but also the southern seaboard. And here, there were two important cities for St. Louis and then New Orleans. So ultimately, it allowed goods to also move to New Orleans. In other words, you have access to two ocean-going ports, and also you have access to all of the American West. So Chicago is called the gateway to the West for good reason, because it was in a way placed sort of providentially. That was understood that it was kind of God's gift. It was such a great location, but its infrastructure was built bit by bit to enable it to do what it did. So the Illinois Canal connected Chicago to New Orleans. But the next thing that happened is that this bit here, the railway from Chicago to Galena, Illinois. Galena was a lead-producing mining town, and that was the first stretch of the railway, and then the railway network boomed. Because what the railway network allowed was unprecedented movement of wheat to Chicago in a way that was not possible before. So I might come back to this tomorrow again, because I won't be able to finish this. If you think about infrastructure and city infrastructure of the 19th century, what we see in Chicago, you have to think about what is being delivered, the modes of delivery, what kind of transactions, and what are the spaces that are created because of those transactions. One of the important things about Chicago is that it not only were canals, railways, and built as infrastructure. Road as infrastructure was not really viable, because about 6 months of the year roads were impassable. So canals and railways were absolutely important for any kind of industrial success. But it also gave rise to office buildings, the institution of the Board of Trade, which got its own building, its own architecture. People didn't know how to build and design a Board of Trade. And also all of this, the grain elevators, the lumber yards, the meat packaging plants, that enable Chicago to take form. Like I'm talking about very much a physical form. I'm going to take couple of more minutes before I finish. What it also did was it actually separated what we now call blue-collar work from white-collar work. Industrial work from writing, accounts and all of that. If you have never seen a grain elevator of the mid-19th century, they look like that. They're massive structures, they're masonry or concrete. And they were basically, what happens is that you pour grain into it, they're graded, they're stacked, they're graded, and they're delivered. We can discuss why is it important. And then the Union stockyards here, they're entire blocks given over to herding cattle. And this is primarily cows and pigs. And this is, the scale of slaughter was immense, because here we are entering into industrial meat production. Before that, to have meat, you needed to butcher an animal, which was, butchering is a skilled job, okay? And then you have to utilize the whole animal. Here, a lot of things came into place to enable that you can actually not just kill literally thousands of animals each day, but actually process them. What it required was, what was invented was considered the disassembly line, which foreboded the assembly line of the Ford manufacturing system. In other words, the carcass comes full, and then it is increasingly, in steps, disassembled in parts. So, the work comes to the worker, okay, because of the conveyor belt. So you're doing a repetitive work. It's a fully industrial. You have to think about butchering and how do you make it an industrial process. But you cannot just, kill a lot of animals and divide into parts. You need to store the meat. So here comes like cold storage spaces, and in other words, meat packaging factory, which were, and mind you, in the mid-19th century, there's no electricity, okay? So they are cooled by actually, yes, ice, okay? So you really have to think about how did they manage this kind of phenomenon. And ultimately, the invention of refrigerated cars, which could carry that meat, because Chicago could not consume that kind of meat, not could just the Midwest. So these railway cars then can go to other cities, connect with other cities to make meat saleable in a packageable version, the way we get in the US supermarkets now. Meat comes in a plastic packet, right? That's not how any animal was consumed before the 19th century. So there's something to think about in terms of the process of disassembly. And with wheat, it is, each farmer, every wheat has its own kind of quality. So to make the process efficient, sacks of wheat were dumped into railway wagons. But what happens is that if you do that, your wheat may be higher quality than mine, but they're all in one place, and the buyer, so the seller is very, this is good for the seller because you're getting rid of your risk, because wheat, it will rot very fast, okay? It'll sprout basically, okay? So you want to get rid of wheat as soon as possible, okay? But what the grain elevators did, and before the grain elevators, wheat was simply dumped on the streets of Chicago, I'm not kidding you. So with the grain elevators, you pour all of that, but wheat got graded into different qualities. And then what happens is that then the seller, the buyer, has some assurance that they're getting some kind of graded product. But it's the railways that ensured that process. Without the railways, there's no need for a grain elevator. And once you have the grain elevators and that kind of process comes in, the Chicago Board of Trade and its entire function, which enabled, again, a lot of paper transactions to happen and news of commodities moving from one location, particularly from Chicago to, again, Eastern Seaboard, this is New York and Philadelphia and Boston, where wheat could be sold without any proximate presence. So between the grain elevators and the Board of Trade, they give certain assurance to the buyer, apart from other things, that they're regulating quality, that they're actually regulating a market. In other words, they've created the market and they take on the job of regulation. I'm going to stop there and we can think about the aesthetics of commerce again beginning tomorrow.